What happens when a son, once lost to the world, finds his way back home, but not without facing the pain of his past choices? This is the story of the prodigal son, a journey of repentance, redemption, and a father's unyielding love that challenges our understanding of grace. Exclusively on Bible Chronicles channel, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun cast a soft, golden light across the fields that stretched out beyond the family's home. The scent of freshly turned earth lingered in the air, mixing with the faint traces of bread baking from the kitchen. It was a peaceful day, the kind where the world felt still and the future seemed distant. But for the younger son, the stillness felt heavy, as if it were closing in on him, suffocating his desire for more. He had always felt there was something beyond the farm, beyond the daily routines, beyond the quiet love of his father. His heart longed for adventure, for excitement, for a life where he could be his own man, independent of his family's expectations. And so that morning, he made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He walked toward his father, who was standing by the well, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. The elder son was still in the fields, working as he always did, his presence a quiet reminder of the life that the younger son felt he could no longer embrace. "Father," the younger son began, his voice tentative, though his heart beat with a strange mixture of hope and fear. The father looked up, his gaze steady, but there was an openness in his eyes, an openness that was always there when his sons approached him. He set down the pail and turned fully toward the boy. "Yes, my son, what is it?" The younger son hesitated. This wasn't something he had prepared for. He had imagined it in his mind countless times, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt too heavy. He swallowed hard before speaking again, his voice a bit more firm this time. "Father, I want to take my share of the inheritance. I want to leave and find my own way." There was a long pause, the weight of the words settling between them. The father's expression faltered, his eyes softening with the pain of a man who understood far more than he had ever wanted to. The inheritance was a symbol of the family's bond, the legacy passed from generation to generation. To ask for it before his time was not just a request, it was a declaration that the son no longer wished to be part of the life they had built together. "I see," the father said at last, his voice quiet, laced with a sorrow that seemed to echo in the air around them. "You wish to go." The younger son nodded, though the weight of his father's words pressed against him, filling him with a strange guilt that he quickly pushed aside. This was what he had wanted for so long, wasn't it? Freedom, independence, his own life. The father sighed deeply, and without a word, turned to walk inside. The younger son watched him go, the sound of his father's footsteps heavy in his chest. It wasn't until the father returned, his hands full with the portion of the inheritance, that the full weight of the decision hit him. "You will take this then," the father said, placing the sum into his son's hands. It was more than money. It was his blessing. It was a decision made with love, though tinged with grief. "Go, if this is what you must do." The younger son took the money without hesitation, the weight of it comforting and terrifying all at once. He looked down at his hands, the coins glinting in the sunlight. For a moment, he almost wished he had not asked for it, that he could have stayed home with his family, where life was simpler, though he knew deep down that the life they offered could never hold him. "I'll make you proud," he said, though his voice cracked slightly. The father nodded, his gaze lingering on his son for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned away, leaving the younger son to face his future alone. As the son walked away, leaving behind the life he had known, the fields, the home, and the family who had loved him, he could not shake the feeling of both exhilaration and deep sorrow. He was free, yet there was something hollow inside him, a faint whisper in his heart that questioned whether he had made the right choice. But the promise of something new, something different, was louder than the quiet doubts. The road stretched before him, a path leading to unknown lands. He could hear the rustling of the wind through the trees and the distant call of birds flying high above him, as if inviting him to join them in their endless journey. The freedom he had sought was here, but it felt strangely isolating. And yet, in the midst of his uncertainty, he took the first step forward. The bustling city was nothing like the quiet fields he had left behind. The air was thick with the scent of spices, sweat, and unfamiliar foods, mingling in the heat of the midday sun. The streets were crowded, a constant flow of people from every corner of the world, each one moving with purpose or lost in their own thoughts. Sounds clattered together, shouts of merchants calling their wares, the clink of coins exchanging hands, the distant murmur of prayers and music. The younger son stood still for a moment, absorbing it all, feeling the weight of his decision settle in his chest. This was it. This was the life he had dreamed of. And yet, even with the vibrancy surrounding him, there was a strange emptiness that lingered just beneath the surface. He had thought the world would offer him fulfillment, but now that he was here, the thrill of freedom seemed to fade, replaced by a growing sense of isolation. He took a deep breath, pushing aside the feelings of doubt that began to rise like an unwelcome tide. The money his father had given him had been enough to buy him the life he wanted. Luxury, indulgence, pleasure. His first days in the city were spent savoring every moment, drinking deeply from the well of his desires. He bought fine clothes, dined in the best establishments, and frequented places where the music never stopped, where laughter flowed freely, and the days slipped into nights without any thought of time. But it didn't take long before the money began to dwindle, slipping away faster than he could keep track. The promises of carefree living, of indulgence without consequence, slowly morphed into a cycle of excess that left him feeling more drained with each passing day. The friends he had made, if they could be called friends, were gone as quickly as his wealth had disappeared, as fickle as the pleasures they had promised him. One evening, as the last of his money disappeared, he sat in a dimly lit room, the flickering of a candle casting long shadows on the walls. His stomach growled, reminding him that his pockets were empty, his resources exhausted. The wine that had once flowed freely now felt like bitter vinegar on his tongue. His mind raced with panic, but there was no solution to the problem before him. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely rising above the sound of the distant city noise. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical burden. He had spent it all, his inheritance, his hope, his future, and now he was alone. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside, a rough-looking man with a face hardened by years of living on the fringes of society. He looked the younger son up and down with a knowing glance, his eyes scanning the room, settling on the last remnants of the boy's wealth. "You look like someone who could use a hand," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. The younger son stared at him, unsure whether he was truly offering help or merely sizing him up as another easy target. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone guarded. "I've got work for you, if you're willing," the man replied, a sly smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's not pretty, but it'll feed you. Pigs need tending, and I've got a place in the fields outside the city." Pigs. The thought of it struck him deeply. It was the kind of work that the poorest of the poor did, the kind of work that his father's servants would never have dreamed of, let alone him. Yet here he was, broken and desperate. What choice did he have? "Fine," the younger son said, his voice flat, defeated. "I'll take it." As he walked with the man through the winding streets, the laughter and music of the city now felt distant and foreign to him, like a dream he had once held, but had long since lost. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the horizon, and for the first time since he had arrived, the weight of his isolation pressed upon him fully. This wasn't the freedom he had imagined. This was not the life he had hoped for. The fields outside the city were barren and desolate, a far cry from the fertile lands of his father's home. The smell of pigs and mud filled his nostrils as he began his work, tending to the animals in a haze of exhaustion and humiliation. Each moment felt like a quiet echo of his failure, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. As the days stretched on, the younger son began to feel the deep hunger of his circumstances. The food he was given, slop and scraps, was hardly enough to keep him going, and there were moments when he wondered if he would even survive. His body grew weak, and his mind too seemed to grow dimmer with each passing day. He found himself staring at the pigs, envious of their ability to eat their fill. There were moments when he thought he might join them, when the emptiness in his stomach seemed unbearable. But it wasn't just physical hunger that gnawed at him. It was a deeper hunger, a longing for something he couldn't name, something beyond food, beyond wealth, beyond the fleeting pleasures he had once chased. It was a hunger for belonging, for purpose, for the love he had once known and so carelessly abandoned. One evening, as he sat on the cold ground, his hands shaking from exhaustion, a thought struck him, one that filled him with both hope and dread. He remembered his father's house. He remembered the warmth of the hearth, the kindness of the servants, the love that had always been there for him, even when he hadn't seen it. He remembered the way his father had looked at him, even as he had asked for his inheritance, with that quiet sadness and unspoken love. A deep ache settled in his chest as he realized how far he had fallen. He had left it all behind, seeking his own way, and now he had nothing. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren fields. The younger son sat slumped against a weathered tree, its twisted branches stretching out like hands that had long since forgotten their purpose. His clothes were ragged now, stained with the grime of days spent tending to pigs, and his body ached with a deep exhaustion that seemed to seep into his bones. His stomach growled, a hollow, painful reminder that food had become a luxury he no longer enjoyed. He hadn't been able to escape the feeling that he was slowly fading into the earth around him, his life marked by the stench of the animals and the unrelenting grind of survival. There was no escape from the muck and the sweat, from the endless days of hard labor. As he sat there, the weight of his mistakes crushed him in waves. He had been foolish, proud, and reckless. He had thought he could do better without his father, but now all that was left was regret. The fleeting pleasures of the city seemed like a distant memory, like something that had never truly been real. Now, he was stuck in this endless cycle, his soul aching for something he could not name. He looked out over the fields where the pigs rooted in the dirt, their snouts pushing through the mud in search of scraps. He had become as low as they were, scrambling for any scrap of food he could find. The realization was bitter, sinking deep into his heart. "Is this really my life now?" he muttered to himself, his voice rough, as though he had not spoken in days. "Is this all I am?" The cold wind whispered through the trees, stirring the dirt beneath his feet. It felt as though the very earth was mocking him, reminding him of the life he had abandoned. He thought of his father, of the servants who were treated better than he was now. The bitterness that had once clouded his heart had faded, replaced with an aching emptiness. He had been so sure that the world would provide, but it had given him nothing but pain. The weight of his actions, the arrogance, the pride, pressed down on him, and for the first time he saw it clearly. "I've lost everything," he whispered, his voice breaking. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the sting of tears behind his eyelids, but he would not let them fall. He would not allow himself that weakness, but as the tears threatened to break free, a strange thought drifted into his mind. He remembered the servants at his father's house, how they had always had enough to eat, how they were treated with dignity. The memory was like a lifeline thrown into the stormy sea of his mind. "I could go back," he said aloud, his voice trembling now. "I could go back. I could ask for forgiveness." The thought was terrifying. The shame of returning, of facing his father, was almost unbearable. But what choice did he have? He had nothing left, no wealth, no pride, no place in this world, only the desperate hope that his father might take him back, even after everything he had done. He rose to his feet slowly, feeling the ache in his legs, the weakness in his body. But something stirred within him. A flicker of hope, faint but undeniable, began to grow. He could not stay here. He could not remain in the muck, wallowing in his own failure. He wiped the dirt from his hands, standing tall despite the shaking in his legs. He wasn't sure what to expect when he returned, but he knew he couldn't stay here any longer. "I'll go back," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "I'll go back and beg for forgiveness. Maybe he'll accept me back." The journey back seemed impossibly long, each step heavier than the last, yet he pressed on. His mind raced with fear and uncertainty. What if his father rejected him? What if his family would never forgive him for the shame he had brought upon them? As he walked, the landscape began to change. The barren fields, once all-encompassing, began to give way to familiar sights. The old trees he had passed as a child, the path that led back to the village, the distant hills where he had once watched the sunset with his family. Each step brought him closer to home, but with it came a storm of emotions: fear, regret, hope. Would he find what he was looking for? Would his father still be waiting for him? The setting sun cast a soft golden light over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. It was a beautiful sight, but it only served to remind him of what he had lost, how far he had fallen, how foolish he had been. And yet, in the midst of the pain, there was a flicker of something else, a glimmer of grace, a hope that perhaps, just perhaps, his father would take him back. The sun was low in the sky as the younger son approached the familiar path that led back to his father's house. It was a road he had traveled countless times in his youth, but now it felt as though he were walking into another life, one that had slipped away from him, far beyond his reach. His clothes were still torn, and his face bore the marks of his time spent in the fields. His stomach growled again, a painful reminder of his hunger. But it was the ache in his chest that hurt the most. The weight of his regret, the shame of his actions, pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. He had rehearsed the words he would say to his father over and over in his mind. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, he found that words failed him. He would fall at his father's feet, he decided, and beg for forgiveness. No, not even forgiveness. He would beg for a place among the servants, for he knew he had forfeited any right to be called a son. As he walked, memories from his past flooded back to him. He remembered the evenings when he and his brother would sit by the fire, the way his father would tell them stories, his voice soft yet strong. He remembered the laughter that had filled the house, the warmth of his mother's embrace, and the way his father's hands had worked with a steady strength. Those were the memories that made his heart ache now. They felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else, someone he used to be. He continued walking, each step bringing him closer to the house he had once known so well, but as he neared the threshold, something unexpected happened. His father, who had been watching from a distance, had seen him coming long before he could see the familiar shape of the house ahead. The father had not abandoned him, not in his heart, not in his mind. He had been waiting, though it had cost him dearly. There, standing at the end of the long driveway, the father saw his son's broken form, walking slowly, a figure of humility and despair. And then, without hesitation, the father did something that seemed completely out of place. He ran. The younger son, caught off guard, stopped in his tracks. His heart began to pound in his chest as he saw his father coming toward him with unsteady steps, his arms outstretched. In that moment, all the shame and guilt that had burdened him for so long seemed to fade into the background. The warmth of his father's love rushed over him, a flood that seemed to erase all the distance between them. The father reached him and embraced him, his strong arms encircling the younger son in a tight, unrelenting hug. The younger son stiffened, his emotions suddenly overwhelming him. He had prepared for rejection, for the cold distance of a father who had been wronged. But there was none of that. There was only love, a love that seemed to wrap around him, lifting him up from the despair he had lived in for so long. "Father," the younger son whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." The father pulled back slightly, his hands still holding the younger son's shoulders, his eyes searching his face with a tenderness that was almost too much to bear. There were no words of condemnation, no rebuke for the choices that had led to this moment. There was only a look that spoke of forgiveness, of deep and unshakable love. "Don't say that," the father replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You were lost, and now you are found. You were dead, and now you are alive." The younger son's heart beat in his chest, the truth of his father's words sinking in slowly. How could this be? How could his father look at him with such love after everything he had done? He had expected anger, punishment, even rejection. But what he found was grace. He could not understand it, but in that moment it did not matter. He had been forgiven. The father turned to the servants who had gathered at the sound of his approach. "Quickly!" he cried, his voice filled with urgency. "Bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Kill the fattened calf, for we are going to feast. My son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The younger son stood there, stunned, as the servants rushed to carry out their father's commands. His mind was still trying to grasp the enormity of the situation. Here he was, in rags, having squandered everything, and yet his father was treating him like royalty. The love he had thought he had lost was being poured out in abundance. For a long time, the younger son had been blind to the love his father had for him. He had been so consumed with his own desires, his own sense of entitlement, that he failed to see the beauty of the relationship he had been given. But now, as his father held him close and ordered a celebration in his honor, the younger son felt the weight of that love like never before. The music began to play, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. The younger son stood in awe, his eyes filled with tears, his heart overwhelmed. His father had not only welcomed him back, he had restored him, body and soul. The feast was not just a celebration of his return, it was a declaration of his worth, of the unbreakable bond between father and son. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the younger son knew that he was home. The sounds of the celebration echoed through the house, drifting through the open windows and over the fields. Laughter rang out from the courtyard, mingling with the music that filled the air, the sound of dancing feet and clinking glasses, a sharp contrast to the quiet stillness that lay beyond the walls. The younger son stood at the center of it all, now clothed in the finest robe, the weight of his father's love heavy on his shoulders. Yet, even as he basked in the warmth of his father's embrace, a shadow began to fall over the scene. Out in the fields, the elder son worked tirelessly, his hands rough from the day's labor, his brow slick with sweat. He had always been the one to stay, the one who had worked alongside his father, tending to the land, providing for the family. He had never asked for more, never sought anything beyond the quiet dignity of his role. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the faint strains of music reached his ears, something twisted inside him. He stopped for a moment, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, the earthy scent of the fields mixing with the faint fragrance of roasted meat. His heart began to pound in his chest, a familiar feeling rising up from deep within him. There, in the distance, was the unmistakable sound of a feast, the kind his father only threw for special occasions. But what was the occasion? He could feel the answer before it fully reached his mind. His brother was back. The thought stung. The older brother had always known that his younger sibling's departure would leave a void in their family, but he had never expected to feel it so acutely. He had worked hard all these years, doing his duty, never once straying from the path laid before him. And now, when his brother, reckless and foolish, returns after squandering everything, he is met with a celebration. The injustice of it burned in his chest like a fire that refused to be put out. With a tight jaw, he began walking toward the house, his boots crunching against the gravel path. The rhythmic sound of his steps seemed to mirror the growing storm in his heart, each beat of his feet in time with the rising resentment. He had not been called in to join the feast, had not been asked to share in the joy of his father's generosity. No, it was as if he had been forgotten, overlooked in the face of his brother's return. By the time he reached the courtyard, the door swung open and the father emerged, his face full of joy, his eyes alight with celebration. "Come, join us," the father called, his voice warm with invitation. "Your brother has returned. We are celebrating his homecoming. Come and share in the feast." But the elder son stood still, his arms crossed over his chest, his face hardening with every word. The father's invitation, so full of love, only served to deepen the hurt. How could he be expected to join in this farce, this spectacle of forgiveness, when his own efforts had never been celebrated? The years of hard work, of dutiful service, had gone unnoticed, overshadowed by the reckless return of someone who had squandered it all. "I've been here," the elder son said, his voice low and sharp, tinged with bitterness. "I've worked for you all these years. I've never disobeyed you, but you never threw a feast for me." His words were thick with accusation, each one cutting through the air with a weight he could no longer hold back. The father looked at him, his brow furrowing, a trace of confusion crossing his face. He could not understand why his eldest son, the one who had stayed, was filled with such anger. "My son," the father said softly, his voice a gentle balm against the harshness of his son's words. "You are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate today, because your brother was lost and is found. He was dead and is alive again." The elder son's face flushed, his pulse quickening as the father's words sank in. He could hear the truth in his father's voice, but it only deepened the ache in his own heart. The injustice was too much to bear. Why should the one who had left, who had ruined everything, be treated as if nothing had happened? Was all of his loyalty, all his years of faithful service, worth so little in comparison? "But he doesn't deserve it," the elder son burst out, his voice raw with emotion. "He took your money, he wasted it all, and now you throw him a feast. What about me? What about the years I've spent working here, never asking for anything? Why didn't I get a feast?" The words spilled out in a torrent, a dam that had been building for so long finally breaking under the weight of resentment and jealousy. His father stood before him, silent for a moment, as though trying to absorb the full force of his son's pain. "Son," the father said gently, his tone filled with an unspoken sadness, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate your brother's return. It was not about what he deserved. It was about him coming back to us." The elder son looked away, his fists clenched at his sides. The words hit him like a wave, crashing over him, pulling him under. What was his father saying? It was not about deserving, it was about love, about restoration. The younger son's return was not a slight to his faithfulness. It was a celebration of grace, a grace he had forgotten to see. He felt the weight of his own pride, his refusal to see the depth of his father's love, not just for him, but for his brother as well. How had he allowed his anger to build so high? How had he missed the truth that stood before him, just beyond his own sense of justice? The father's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but firm. We had to celebrate, because your brother was lost and is found. You were never lost, but my love for you has always been here. Do not let your heart be hardened by pride. Come, join us, and be glad, for we are all part of this family. The elder son's heart trembled, the weight of his father's words sinking in slowly. He had always thought that being the good son meant proving his worth. But his father's love was not something that could be earned. It was a gift, freely given. And in that moment, the elder son realized that his own heart had been the one that needed healing all along. The celebration continued into the night, but the elder son stood outside, his gaze fixed on the open courtyard where the sounds of joy and music filtered through the doors. His father's words still echoed in his mind, each one like a gentle hammer chiseling away at the stone of resentment in his heart. He had never felt so torn, so conflicted. The pride that had once seemed like a shield around his heart now felt like chains, binding him in a way he couldn't escape. The cool night air brushed against his face, carrying with it the scent of the feast, roasted meat, fresh bread, the sweetness of wine. Yet, in spite of the warmth of the fire and the laughter from inside, the elder son felt a coldness deep within him. It was the chill of his own anger, his own sense of justice, still not satisfied. His father stepped out into the quiet evening, his footsteps soft on the stone path. The elder son could hear him approach, the familiar sound of his father's sandals on the ground, yet he did not turn to face him. "Why don't you come in?" the father asked gently, standing beside his son. The elder son could hear the sadness in his voice, the weight of the love that he had tried to offer, the peace he had extended. But it was not enough. Not yet. "I don't understand," the elder son said, his voice thick with emotion, though he tried to hide it. "Why should I celebrate him after everything he's done, after everything he's taken from us? You don't even seem to care about what he's done to you, what he's done to this family." His words came out sharper than he had intended, the bitterness rising like bile in his throat. He couldn't help it. The injustice of it all felt too heavy to bear. His father, who had worked so hard for their family, who had provided and sacrificed, now showered this forgiveness on a son who had squandered everything. The father stood quietly for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back. There was no anger in his expression, no rebuke in his eyes, just a quiet understanding, as if he had been waiting for this moment to come. He spoke, his voice soft, as though choosing his words carefully. "My son," the father began, "I know this is hard for you to understand. It is hard for anyone to understand, really. The world says that what your brother did was unforgivable, that he should pay the price for his mistakes, that he should suffer the consequences of his choices. But grace is not like the world's justice. Grace is a gift, freely given, not earned. Your brother was lost, but now he is found. He was dead, but now he is alive." The elder son shook his head, the frustration building again. "But what about me, father? I've been here all this time. I've worked. I've obeyed. I've never asked for anything. And now he comes back, and you give him everything." The father reached out, gently placing a hand on his son's shoulder, a touch that was tender yet firm. "You are always with me, my son," he said, his voice quiet but full of affection. "And everything I have is yours. But your brother was lost. He was dead to us, but now he is back. How can we not rejoice in that?" The elder son stood still, his heart heavy. The weight of his father's words pressed against him, but he did not know how to shake the anger that still clung to him like a second skin. He had worked so hard, so tirelessly, and now his brother, who had disrespected the family, who had abandoned them all, was being welcomed back without so much as a second thought. It felt like a betrayal. The father's hand remained on his shoulder, a silent comfort in the midst of his turmoil. "I understand that you are hurt, my son," the father continued, his voice soft but filled with the weight of years of wisdom. "I understand that you feel as though your work has gone unnoticed, that your faithfulness has been overlooked. But you must know this. I have never stopped loving you. I have never been absent. Everything I have, everything I am, is yours, and your place in this family has always been secure." The elder son's heart ached. He had always known that his father loved him, but the idea of unconditional love, love that did not come with expectations, love that was not earned by service, was something he had never fully understood. He had always felt that love had to be measured, balanced by what he gave and what he received. But now, standing here with his father, he saw the truth. Grace was not a transaction. It was a gift that could not be earned, only received. The night air grew colder, and the sound of music and laughter drifted to them again, but for the first time, the elder son did not feel the bitterness that had once filled him. He still struggled with the idea of grace, still wrestled with the notion of his brother's return. But the weight in his chest began to lift, and something inside him shifted, like the turning of a key in a lock. "I don't know if I can forgive him," the elder son said, his voice faltering. "I don't know if I can understand why you would." The father smiled softly, his eyes filled with compassion. "Forgiveness is not always easy. It does not always come in an instant. But you must know that your brother's return does not diminish your place here. It does not change the love I have for you." The elder son stood there quiet, his emotions still swirling, but something deep within him had begun to settle. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't have to. What mattered now was that his father loved him, and that love was not dependent on his brother's mistakes. It was not contingent on his own righteousness. It was a love that flowed freely, a love that had no bounds. The elder son took a deep breath, letting the stillness of the moment wash over him. He wasn't ready to join the feast, not yet. But perhaps in time he would learn to embrace the gift of grace that his father had shown him, not just toward his brother, but toward himself as well. And so, with his father beside him, the elder son stood there in the quiet of the night, feeling the weight of all he had learned and all he had yet to learn. The lesson of grace had been offered. It was now up to him to receive it.